Welcome back, everybody. We're going to jump right into this episode of Reaper Minis TV, picking up where we left off last time, so we're going to get right into turn 2 of our battle report. And here's just a refresher of how the board looked at the end of turn 1. And what we're going to do for the first activation is we've got Crow's Nest Willie and his boys firing at the oncoming Razig. Now 2 are going to fire at that lead ogre and 2 are firing at Gronk Split Eye. And what we end up with are rolls from Crow's Nest Willie and 1 Marine on the ogre, and we end up with results of 8 and 9 after taking everything into account, so those both miss. Against Gronk Split Eye, we have ending results of 11 and 12, so we end up with just 1 hit, but it is going to cause 2 points of damage or 2 wounds to him because it's a slow fire weapon and they weren't using the broadside ability. So we're going to put a single die there that has 2 on it to signify that he's taken his first 2 damage tracks. The second activation also goes to Razig, and what we're going to have here is Mr. Blood and his crew firing at Gronk Split Eye and the ogre just like the previous troop did. So they're going to split their fire between those 2 targets there. We've got Mr. Blood and 2 crew that are going to do focus and shoot actions at Gronk Split Eye, and the other 3 crew are going to do focus and shoot actions all at that other lead ogre. What we end up with are 2 hits on Gronk and 1 damaging hit on the ogre. So, good amount of fire coming out of them, peppering the incoming Razig with all sorts of shot. So what we end up with is going to be a single die next to this ogre, signifying the 1 wound he has, and we're going to put Gronk's die at a 4, even though he only has 3 damage tracks right now, and that's really to remind us that we need to take the tough roll that we're going to take now. Now he has tough 2, which means on a d10, an 8, 9, or 10 means he'll still be alive. You saw we rolled a 4, so he's dead and we're pulling him from the table. Alright, so our next activation is going to be on the Revan side, and the ogres are going to go. To begin with, the ogre that's towards the bottom of the screen that's skirting around the rocks and bushes down there, he's going to sneak up and he's going to do a move and charge action to get engaged with one of Mr. Blood's crew down here, but since he doesn't have an action left, he can't fight this turn, so he's just going to get in there. And then that lead ogre is going to charge and go in hand to hand with one of the crew, and then Kagunk is going to charge and go into hand to hand with Mr. Blood. Now on a charge action, if you're within 2 inches of your enemy at the end of your regular move, you get an extra 2 inches of movement for free to go ahead and close the distance. So here's everybody that's in our hand-to-hand, and between regular attacks and defensive strikes that everybody gets when you're fighting in hand-to-hand, we got a bunch of rolling to do. Now from the ogres, we have some modifiers to take care of first. Kagunk normally gets 1 melee attack, but he's going to go Frenzy because he has that special ability, and that means he can get an extra melee attack for every -1 to his melee attack value that he wants to take. If you have the Frenzy ability, you can only do a maximum of doubling your melee attacks, and since he starts with 1, he can only go to 2, so we're going to get +1 attack, but -1 to his chance to hit, but then he's also going to use the Enraged ability that is the Faction Doctrine, part of the Faction Doctrine that the Revan are bringing today. What Enrage does is it allows you to get a +1 melee attack value for every -1 on your defensive value that you take during this particular combat. And it can only be up to the number of melee attack value that you have, but he has 2 now because of the Frenzy. So now he's going to get +2 melee attack value and -2 to his defensive value. So he is net +1 melee attack, +1 melee attack value, and -2 to his defensive value. Okay, so for the ogre's attacks, and each of them has 2 attacks, we get scores of modified scores of 11 and 13 against Mr. Blood, and we also have an 11 and a 13 against that skeleton crewman. Now, against Mr. Blood, that's going to end up being 4 hits, not just 2, and that's because Kagunk has the Mighty special ability, because he's big and burly and strong, so every damaging hit really ends up doing 2 points or 2 hits worth of damage. On the skeleton crewman, even though we have 2 hits, it's actually going to be 3 points worth of damage because he has the cleave ability. And what that means is, if you score a hit and score at least 3 points higher than you needed to, you do an extra point of damage. The skeleton crewman has a defensive value of 9, the 13 is 3 higher than that, so they end up doing an extra point of damage there. The next thing it's time for are the strikebacks or defensive strikes of Mr. Blood and the crewman, because when you're fighting a hand-to-hand, unless your opponent hits you first with some kind of ability that allows him to do that, you get to strike back in hand-to-hand combat. Now, Mr. Blood is going to suffer a -2 to his rolls because Kagunk has an ability called Bludgeon, and if you're larger than your opponent and you have the Bludgeon ability and you hit him in hand-to-hand, he suffers a -2 penalty to his defensive strikes. So what we end up with are 2 strikebacks from Mr. Blood, and our results are 10 and 12, and 2 strikebacks from the skeleton crewman, and his results are 11 and 13. So on that ogre, he's going to take 2 more hits, so we're going to pull down that 1 that's on the d6 that we had above him previously. We're just going to move that over to a 3. And we're going to put 1 wound on Kagunk, and if you remember back on the first video of the battle report, I said I might make an error here or there. Here's one of them. Kagunk should actually have taken 2 wounds here because his defensive value is down to 10 for this attack sequence because of his enrage. But I forgot to do that, so he only takes 1 wound. And we're going to put 3 wounds or points of damage on the skeleton crewman and 4 on Mr. Blood. And again, we're just putting the dice at that level of damage, and we'll pull people if we need to, or we'll give people tough rolls as we need to right now. The ogre has tough 2. We roll a 7. That's a 9. So that's not a 10. So he's going to be killed. We're going to pull him. The skeleton crewman has tough 0, which means he needs a 10 exactly. We get a 3, so he is confirmed to be destroyed. And then Mr. Blood has tough 1, and we roll a 10 exactly. So he is left with just his last damage track intact. The ogre that came in was killed, and the skeleton crewman that was being attacked was killed. Kagunk has taken some damage, and Mr. Blood has taken a bunch of damage. The next activation for turn 3 is going to be back on the Revan side, so the bugbears are going to go, and out of the 4 of them, 2 of them do a move run action to get into the fight or get closer to the fight, and the other 2 do move and charge actions to actually get into hand-to-hand or base-to-base with enemies, but there's no attacks or anything that's going on there right now. The next activation is going to be for the Revan also, and the mage, or the shaman, is just going to move and run to get into either some kind of combat or spell casting range so he can be more effective from here on out. Next up we're going to have a Razig action, and now one of the soul cannons is going to fire at Kagunk. Now since Kagunk is in hand-to-hand with Mr. Blood, Mr. Blood has to make a discipline check or become shaken. Just because he's undead doesn't mean he can't become shaken, and being shaken is a bad thing. But he makes that test successfully, and they also end up hitting Kagunk, causing 2 points of damage, which would normally kill him, but he makes his tough test and he lives for now. Next activation is going to be for the other soul cannon. It's also going to shoot at Kagunk. The discipline check has to be taken again for Mr. Blood. It's a separate troop that's attacking here, or firing into the hand-to-hand that he's involved in. Passes his discipline test again. The standard discipline test is your model's discipline plus a d10 needs to be 10 or greater. Really not going to be much of a problem for him. He's got a 6, so pretty good chance of passing it, but they do miss Kagunk this time around, so the magical cannonball goes whizzing over his head. Alright, and that is it for turn 2 of the battle report. We'll see you in a minute with turn 3.